Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices is made possible in part by Allstate and the Searle Funds at the Chicago Community Trust.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices. I'm Marissa Parra, reporter with CBS 2 Chicago. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. Here's what we have on the show tonight. A special Black Voices, Latino Voices crossover conversation. We talk about what's behind the differing responses to and media coverage of Ukrainian refugees over those from other countries. Plus, advocates push for funding to get lead pipes out of childcare facilities. And a network of Illinois legal aid organizations hope to get a budget boost from the state to expand its offerings.
Women only make up 8% of the professions in the automotive industry.
And a local nonprofit wants to put Chicago's girls in the fast lane to STEM success. First off tonight, as Russian forces invade Ukraine, more than 2 million Ukrainians have now fled their homes and sought refuge in neighboring countries, many of them greeted with warmth and generosity. But people fleeing conflict or disaster in other countries have not always been welcomed with such open arms in Europe or even here in the United States. At the southern border, thousands of migrants seeking refuge from desperate situations in the Caribbean and South and Central America wait in camps for processing, and many have been turned back home. Joining us now as part of a special crossover discussion with Chicago Tonight Black Voices are Sarah Hagdusti, Executive Director of Win Without War, Fasika Alem, the Programs Director of United African Organization, Daisy Funes, Executive Director of Centro Romero, and finally, Laura Washington, a columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times. First of all, thank you all for being with us for this really important discussion we want to have here. Daisy, we'll start with you. We don't always hear South and Central Americans or Caribbeans fleeing their countries referred to as refugees. Let's start with a quick explainer on the difference between a refugee and a migrant.
So the difference between a refugee and immigrant is the refugees are coming for conditions that are out of their control. For example, somebody who is a refugee because they're going to or they're receiving persecution, there is a war, and they are looking for a safe haven where they can be protected, and they have to qualify and prove they are refugees. Now, immigrants, they come for different situations. They can be a condition of their home country as well, but mostly economic. To better they improve their lives and have a better future for their families and their kids. So that's the difference between a refugee who's been persecuted without any protection and living crossing countries without any assistance.
Okay. And Sarah, do you think the term used to describe people fleeing conflict affects how they're treated by the countries they flee to? And also, who determines who is a refugee?
I think absolutely the way we describe people fleeing from violence determines how they're treated. And I think in this conflict, it's been really interesting to see some of the different terms used. I know that in a lot of the coverage I've seen, when we talk about Ukrainian refugees, they're described as refugees. And more importantly, they're described as people who, at times, many will say, look like us. Whereas in other cases, we not only don't hear those words, we hear people described in really dehumanizing ways. They're referred to as waves, they're referred to as illegals, they're referred to as aliens. And I think it's really important for us to remember that no matter what people are fleeing from, no matter what circumstances are, people are asking for help. And when they are, they deserve to be treated with dignity and compassion.
So, Sarah, you bring up a really good point, and I want to come back to that in just a moment. But first, I want to give you a listen to what Chicagoan Maria Klimczak had to say about her perspective on why Europe has been so quick to receive Ukrainian immigrants. She herself was a refugee from Ukraine to America just 30 years ago. Take a listen.
NATO and all European countries, they don't want to have a Russian as a neighbor. This is why they all are together to help Ukraine. Not only Poland, but Slovakia, 5 countries. They're going to have a border with Russia. But unfortunately, it's only Ukraine now protect Europe from Russia. We have a deal with President of Russia who treated people with a nuclear weapon. And this is why we have to be honest that what the next day, your country will be the next. And this is why we have to protect those people. Not because Ukrainians are special nation. This is not a civil war. It's not a conflict. It's a humanitarian crisis in Europe.
Vasika, I want to turn to you now. As Maria says, Ukraine has an obvious aggressor in Russia's President Putin, but when the conflict is more complex in nature, do you think that changes whether people feel refugees are more or less deserving of help and protection?
Yeah, I think that has some effect on public perception of who is deserving, right? And in this conflict in Ukraine, there's a clear aggressor. But for a lot of the refugees and asylum seekers that are fleeing from the global south, it's not as easy to identify the aggressor, right? So in many cases, the conflicts are internal. You're talking about civil war, you're talking about a decline in the political stability that creates unsafe conditions for those that live in those countries. So it makes it difficult to identify who the aggressor is. And there might even sometimes be the perception that it is their own doing, right? When it's internal versus when you have an external aggressor.
And Daisy, you were a refugee from El Salvador during the civil war in that country. Do you feel like Americans reacted to that crisis the same way they're reacting to Ukraine's?
Only if I wish. When I came here to the United States, looking for asylum, looking for leaving my home country because of the conditions in 1980, part of our life, and I mean, feeling and leaving my family, my friends, but also my best friends killed and dead in the moment that my aunt also in the clandestine jails because of being organized. In the process, there were no benefits for the Salvadorians because it was a conflict where this country was very well involved in that war. So they never recognized us as refugees from El Salvador. We never received that benefit of receiving any help, any support. That's how this institution began to help those that came in that moment. They were not only coming from El Salvador, but they were coming from Honduras, Nicaragua. I don't know, Central America was in a turmoil at that moment in 1980. So now the previous administration talking about how people see us as an immigrants, right? People of color say, well, they're young, crossing the border. They are like strong men, can be rapists. The administration, so it's not have been very welcoming to the immigrants or refugees of the South. So.
Oh, Sarah, I want to turn to you because you kind of touched on this a little bit in so many words. Do you feel the media is covering this particular refugee crisis differently than others?
Absolutely. And I think many people of color who are watching your show know what it's like to have their communities or their countries be called uncivilized, which is just one of the comments we've heard from media commentators during this debate. We've heard people describe that what's happening in Europe is unprecedented, which also really doesn't take into account history and recent conflicts that have happened for some people within their lifetimes when we look at World War II, for example. And I think what I'm excited about is that we are having this conversation. I know that over the past few years, especially after the death of George Floyd, many have been looking at unconscious bias. Many have been looking at racial justice and how that plays out in different moments. And I think this is a great example of how it's playing out here. And I'm hoping that more people will recognize it, talk about it, and take action to change it.
We have just about a minute left. Fasika, I want to ask you, what would you ask the U.S. to do for other groups of refugees that you've seen them do for Ukrainians in the last 2 weeks?
Yeah, you know, Ukraine is not the only country that is experiencing conflict, right? We're still seeing conflict in many countries around the world. And, you know, for our community, we would like to see a designation of TPS for Cameroon, right? Cameroon has been engulfed in internal conflict and as well as external threats in the region that have really made it difficult for Cameroonians to return, especially those that are in the U.S. to return to Cameroon. And so the first thing that comes to mind is a designation of TPS for Cameroon that we feel the administration has been really delaying and hesitating to do, even though all the evidence points to the need for that.
Laura, unfortunately, we only have about 10 seconds. Anything you want to add?
Well, I would just say that the media is obviously, as you just heard, plays a major role in this. And we as journalists need to be very conscious of how we use terminology and words and the impact that they have. And there's been a lot of discussions in newsrooms, particularly since the George Floyd conversation emerged, about terminology and about how we label people and the dehumanizing impact it can have when you use terms like refugees and undocumented and when you're not sensitive enough to entire groups of people and some of the racist undertones that are developed there. And part of it is about diversifying the media, because you got to think about who's telling those stories, who's behind those cameras, and who's using those words. And the more diversity you can bring into the media, the more voices you could bring, the more sensitivity comes along with it.
Well, we appreciate all of your voices. This is where we will have to leave it on our end, but be sure to check out Chicago Tonight Black Voices for more on the global treatment of refugees, including a look at how refugees from Syria and other parts of the world were treated back in 2015 versus Ukrainian refugees today. And now, our thanks to our guests today, Sarah Hagdusti, Fasika Alem, and Daisy Funes, as well as Laura Washington. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
High lead levels in water, it's not just unpleasant, it can have devastating health effects, especially for children. It can lead to damage to the brain and nervous system, even lead to learning and behavioral issues. It's a problem we feel particularly strongly here in Illinois. It has an estimated 700,000 lead service lines and 1 million more of unknown origin. That is more than any other state. Governor J.B. Pritzker's proposed budget has nearly $500 million in federal money to tackle the problem. But as Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg reports, some advocates want more funding, in particular, to remove lead pipes connected to child care facilities.
Back in 2017, the state of Illinois began requiring daycares to test the lead levels in their water and come up with a mitigation plan if they found any. El Hogar del Niño, which serves families in Pilsen and Little Village, discovered it had a handful of water fixtures with high lead levels.
What we do exceptionally well here at El Hogar del Niño is early childhood. What we don't do well, or at least what we are not familiar with, are complex environmental issues.
But they got help through the nonprofit Elevate, which installed water filters and eventually got the lead service line connected to the building replaced.
Had we been required to change those out on our own, we would have had to have removed resources from the classrooms to do that work. And so when you're working with vulnerable children and families like we do, or any children, that's just not an option that you want to exercise.
In recent years, a patchwork of government and nonprofit programs has come together, offering help with testing and mitigation. But the need still far outstrips the available assistance, especially for high-priority places like child care facilities.
It's really going to take a village to tackle this issue. But the good thing is we know how to do it.
About 20% of licensed child care facilities in Illinois have told the state they found lead in their water, though not all of those are necessarily fixtures used for drinking water. Elevate's Caroline Packenham says the providers they've worked with are even more likely to face high lead levels.
Depending on what type of facility you're in, we were finding that between 30 and 50% of providers were finding lead in their drinking water. We would really love to see statewide assistance.
Governor J.B. Pritzker's budget proposal includes $565 million in loans and grants to replace lead service lines. But that's all money from the federal infrastructure package. Some advocates want the state to kick in $300 million of its own funding, $60 million of which would be dedicated to child care facilities.
The health and well-being of our children is worth it to put that money aside and make sure we have enough to make sure every child care facility is free of a lead service line.
Justin Williams says his group's had positive conversations with the governor's office about its proposal. As he sees it, it's not just that children are especially vulnerable, it's also about racial equity.
Black and Latinx Illinoisans are twice as likely as white Illinoisans to be living in the communities that contain almost all of the state's lead service lines. We really need to make sure we're not leaving this problem literally at the feet of people of color in Illinois.
There is work underway in the General Assembly. Last year, State Representative Lamont Robinson sponsored a successful bill requiring water utilities around the state to document lead service lines and come up with a plan to replace them.
We removed lead out of paint, but we have not done this in our water.
But eliminating service lines is a long-term effort. Depending on the scope of the problem, utilities have between 15 and 34 years to replace lead pipes by law. In the meantime, Robinson's pushing a bill this year that carves out $50 million to send free water filters to people who need them.
We know that we don't have enough money to replace all lead pipes, and while we're waiting on those funds, we need to do something right now.
For Chicago Tonight Latino Voices, I'm Nick Blumberg.
Robinson also says he's supportive of the idea to add more state funding to remove lead pipes. The governor's office did not respond to a request for comment on that proposal. And an Illinois initiative is looking to up their ability to offer legal support to the Black and Latino populations disproportionately impacted by incarceration and deportation. The Illinois Access to Justice Coalition is comprised of different nonprofit legal aid organizations and offer Illinoisans free legal representation and free training on legal literacy. And that can be a lot of people. According to Legal Services Corporation's 2017 Justice Gap report, 86% of the civil legal problems reported by low-income Americans received inadequate or no legal help. 71% of low-income households experienced at least one civil legal problem in that year. And those problems can include issues of domestic violence, health care, housing, and disability. The coalition's leaders say with more money from the state, they can offer better resources to Illinoisans who may need the help navigating a complex legal system. Joining us now with more are the women spearheading that effort. Ere Rendon, Vice President of Immigrant Justice at the nonprofit The Resurrection Project, and Tanya Woods, Executive Director of the West Side Justice Center. Thank you both for joining us. Ere, we'll start with you. Can you give us a brief overview of the range of services that your member organizations can offer?
Yeah, so Illinois Access to Justice, right, as you mentioned, it's a statewide program. And so we focus on all sorts of legal cases, everything from, housing, so folks facing eviction, to family matters, domestic violence, all the way to deportation, defense, asylum, helping the, new refugees that are arriving from Afghanistan.
Great. Well, we have to ask about this. There's been a lot of talk about former Illinois Speaker of the House, Mike Madigan. And earlier this week, there was a report that Mike Madigan had asked then Alderman Danny Solis to get business insurance for his insurance broker son from your organization. Now, of course, we will also share that the Resurrection Project has not been accused of any wrongdoing. They say they've cooperated with the investigation. But do you have any response to that report?
Illinois Access to Justice was established because dozens of organizations, advocated for desperately needed funding, as you stated at the top of your segment. The campaign earned support from, a diverse group of Black and Brown faith and community activists and elected officials. And the work that we've done since then has been incredible.
Well, thank you for answering that. Tanya, I want to move to you now. When we talk about the needs for these types of legal services, who really needs them the most when we look at the population?
So we're looking at people who are from communities like the one that I'm from. I come from the west side of Chicago in the Garfield Park community, and those the folks that I grew up with are the same people in the same communities. They live in historically marginalized communities, underrepresented, over-policed, over-criminalized, often overlooked and underrepresented. So these are people who go to work every day as best as they can, just like you or I, but often are stymied by a system that, you know, throws up all kinds of barriers in front of them to prevent them from being able to, you know, live a decent life, keep a safe neighborhood, send their children to good schools. So we offer services to anybody who wants them and is in need of them and has found themselves left behind because of either systemic barriers, low income, under education, or underemployment.
And it sounds like you guys are trying to bridge the gap right there between different populations, maybe not getting the help that they need so much. Tanya, how do you measure whether a program is successful, and what is the benchmark?
That's actually an excellent question, because typically when we talk about measuring and success, it's a quantitative analysis that's often done to determine whether or not a program is successful, especially one when we're talking about either legal services or human services or social services, and there's less emphasis on qualitative. And what we try to do at Access to Justice is emphasize both. So not only do we count the number of screenings or the number of people who were helped by directly legal representation, or even those who've been able to receive services and be trained as community navigators, but we also talk about the qualitative impact, outcomes, you know, the difference that it makes in an individual's life and their family and that of their community. So we've trained over 2,200 community navigators in the past couple of years. We've, you know, been able to provide thousands of legal screenings, as well as you know, thousands of individuals that have been able to receive legal education. But it's a both and.
That's a good answer. Ere, I want to turn to you now. We talk about legal literacy training. Can you tell us a little bit about how training people on how to interpret legalese, so to speak, really might help them avoid getting entangled in the legal system in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, first, our approach is to train we want to make community experts in the community. So we recruit, train, and organize what we call community navigators. So primarily directly impacted folks that are immigrants themselves, folks that may have been incarcerated previously, or who have dealt with the legal system in the past. We train them, and then we provide them the tools and the skills necessary to be able to go out into the community and give this information. So they're going to talk about what people's rights are, so perhaps prevent a deportation or an arrest. And then they're going to talk about their rights if they're facing eviction. And then if necessary, connect them to the attorney through one of our legal service providers as well.
I have a tough assignment for both of you. In one sentence, for both of you, what would upping $20 million, you're asking the governor to allocate $20 million for Illinois Access to Justice organizations, up from $10 million. What would that bring? Tanya, we'll start with you.
Sure. Increased inclusivity. It would mean broadening and baking a bigger pie so that there are more resources for the communities that often get so very little.
Okay. Ere, what would your answer be in one sentence?
It means we would be able to protect more Black and Brown immigrants who are residents of Illinois, ensuring that they have trustworthy legal services in their communities.
Well, thank you both for your time. Thank you so much for explaining a little bit of that. Our thanks to Tanya Woods and Ere Rendon. Educators have been making extra efforts to encourage children, especially girls, to explore STEM fields, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That's because women are still vastly underrepresented in STEM occupations, only 27% according to the U.S. 2020 census. So to help with this, the local nonprofit Girls for Science is offering a free program called Saturday STEM Academy for girls ages 10 to 18.
We're so proud this spring to offer the science of cars, working with a local training facility, Fast Lane Training Center on the west side of Chicago. We'll be introduced to how does a car work? You know, what is the function of having oil in your engine? What does those check engine light indicators really mean? And, you know, how can you maintain your car from one season to another? These topics are so relevant because women only make up 8% of the professions in the automotive industry. for girls between the ages of 10 through 18 to walk into a city college of Chicago or on a university campus and to be partnered with current college students or women of color in all areas of profession, from chemistry, medical science, robotics. It really does help to reverse the stigma. It is a great energy, the spirit of the woman, right? We move mountains.
And to learn a little bit more on Girls for Science, you can visit our website for more information. And that's our show for this weekend. Next week on Latino Voices, Phil Ponce will be right here in the host chair. In the meantime, you can catch my reporting on CBS 2 Chicago. We'll leave you tonight with a song from Emilio Delgado, known to many as Luis on Sesame Street. That role was the longest-running role for a Mexican-American in a TV series ever. Delgado died earlier this week at 81. Now, from all of us here at Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices, I'm Marissa Parra. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. Stay healthy, stay safe, y buenas noches.
Everybody likes pretty new words, and I have one you'll love to hear. Just like magic, this very nice word makes the clouds all disappear. Alegría, 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 alegría.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that's proud to serve its community through pro bono legal services.